Hey everybody, and welcome to a lecture on confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency among humans to interpret evidence as supporting their prior beliefs to a greater extent than is actually warranted. So confirmation bias is one of these cognitive biases or systematic errors in judgment that we humans are often prone to. We can think of this in terms of arguments, as we've been thinking about in this class, in the following way. We can say confirmation bias consists in our tendency to instinctually overweight the inductive probability of arguments whose conclusions we believe or think are likely. So if we have an argument from P to Q, we're going to overweight the strength of that argument or assign a higher inductive probability than it merits if we think that Q is a proposition that's really probable or something that we believe. So there's a really nice graphical representation of confirmation bias in the Anger textbook. So here we have two agents, A and B, and they start out with some degree of belief or some probability that they're assigning to a particular hypothesis. So A starts out very confident in the hypothesis, B starts out relatively unconfident in the hypothesis, namely confident that the hypothesis is false. Now, on this x-axis, we have number of trials. So we're doing some experiments or gathering some evidence to try to ascertain whether or not this hypothesis is in fact true or false. So we get more and more evidence as time goes on. What you'd like to see is you'd like to see A and B coming closer together, right? You'd like to see them converging on a particular probability as they get more and more evidence. But that's not what happens in the case of confirmation bias, right? In the case of an agent suffering from confirmation bias, as they get more and more evidence, they tend to overestimate how much that evidence supports the views that they were initially inclined to. So person A was initially inclined to think this particular proposition or hypothesis was true, and so for them the evidence leads them to get more and more confident that it's true. Whereas person B was initially inclined to disbelieve the proposition in question. They thought the hypothesis in question was relatively unlikely. So for them, as they get more and more evidence, their belief in the proposition tends to go even down. They assign even less and less epistemic probability. So this is a nice graphical representation of what's going on in confirmation bias. There's a famous example of confirmation bias. It was taken from a 1970s study done by some psychologists. They showed that exposing opponents and supporters of the death penalty to the same body of empirical evidence led to further attitude polarization among these subjects. That is to say, right, they took a group of students, some of them supported the death penalty, some of them opposed the death penalty, and they gave them all the same two studies, one of which showed some evidence that tended to support some of the arguments for the death penalty, and one of them was a study that tended to show some arguments that were, or some empirical evidence that was against some of the arguments for the death penalty. You might think, oh, well, everybody's getting the same evidence now, so they're going to tend to move closer to each other. But instead, they become more polarized, right? That can be explained in terms of confirmation bias because the subjects who initially favored the death penalty tend to discount the study that opposed the death penalty and overweight the study that also favored the death penalty. Whereas students who initially opposed the death penalty tended to discount the study that favored the death penalty, overweight the one that tended to support it. And so that led the students to have even more disparate or even more divided views by the end. There's a particularly egregious sort of confirmation bias that would go something like this. Suppose K is a proposition that represents your entire stock of current knowledge. So it's a sort of conjunction of everything that you know, and you're considering the argument that goes from K to some proposition X, and the argument that goes from K to some proposition not X, right? And suppose that you judge the first argument to be the stronger. So that means, right, you think the first argument has higher inductive probability than the second. That means you assign higher epistemic probability to the proposition X than to its non-X, than to its negation not X. So you're inclined to believe proposition X, right? So you have an inclination to believe X. If you have confirmation bias, then you might tend to overweight evidence or learning other propositions and thinking that they would support X as well. So For example, consider the argument where you add proposition P to your stock of knowledge. So you have K, P, and you're looking about how much does that support X. And then you consider, if you learn not P, or if you added not P to your stock of premises. So you have K not P leads to X. If you thought that both of those arguments, both of these new arguments, the one adding P and the one adding not P, have higher inductive probability than the previous argument, right? The argument that just went from K to X, then this would be a particularly egregious sort of confirmation bias, right? If you think both adding P to your stock of knowledge and adding not P to your stock of knowledge both support X to a greater extent than you previously had, that would be a particularly egregious sort of confirmation bias. And we could see a historical example, arguably something like this happened in the story that's recounted in the Agner textbook involving the psychologist Alfred Adler and the philosopher of science Karl Popper. Karl Popper was a famous philosopher of science who actually worked briefly during the early part of the 20th century for Alfred Adler, who at the time was a very famous psychologist who had a lot of interesting ideas about psychology. And there's a story that Popper recounts of his time with Adler. He says, once in 1919, I reported to him, that is to Adler, a case which to me did not seem particularly Adlerian. It didn't really fit his theory very well, but which he found no difficulty in analyzing in terms of his theory of inferiority feelings, although he had not even seen the child, as the subject that Popper's talking about. Slightly shocked, I asked him how he could be so sure. Because of my thousand-fold experience, he replied, whereupon I could not help saying, and with this new case, I suppose your experience has become 1,001-fold. So Popper's basic objection to Adler here is, look, you were going to take this new case, this report I'm giving you about this child, to be evidence for your theory or confirming of your theory, regardless of what I was actually reporting about the child. I could have said the child had this particular set of feelings, or the child lacked this particular set of feelings. And either way, you would have tried to analyze it in terms of your theory and taken that as additional support for your theory, right? Should be an egregious sort of case of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias can also be used to explain what's known as the primacy effect, right? So when people are given a sequence of informational inputs, they tend often to be more heavily influenced by those that they receive earlier, and that's what we call the primacy effect. So an example of this, right, if I hear of a doctor succeeding and then failing, so maybe I hear of the doctor having 5 patients who come in sick and all get cured and go out well, and then maybe after that I hear of a couple cases of the doctor not doing so well, or their patients not making it, I'm going to tend to have a higher view of that doctor than if the order in which I had received that information was reversed. So if I heard of another doctor who had 2 patients that didn't make it, and then I found out that they also had 5 patients who did make it, I tend to have a lower view of that doctor than the first one. And this can be explained in terms of confirmation bias, right? Because if the initial information I get about the doctor fixes my initial beliefs, and then confirmation bias makes it hard to shift those initial beliefs, that could explain why this primacy effect occurs, why I sort of stick with thinking that the doctor I initially thought was good is good, and stick with thinking that the doctor I initially thought was not so good is not so good. Right? And this tendency can highlight the importance of building a good reputation for a doctor, or a lawyer, or other professionals early on in their career if people are susceptible to confirmation bias, because it can be hard to shift your reputation once it's not good. Right? There's abundance of other examples we could think of that illustrate confirmation bias. Lots of examples from medicine. Oftentimes in the history of medicine, right, a doctor would have a theory or a belief that a particular method of treatment was effective, and they would go about administering that treatment, and they'd always think that they were gaining more evidence that the treatment was working every time that they had a patient who ended up making it. And they would overweight those cases and be like, oh, look, I can point to all these cases where these patients are recovering. That must be evidence that my method is working. And they would tend to discount the cases where patients didn't recover. That's an example of confirmation bias. This can also happen in finance, where an investor might have a particular theory or method for how to pick stocks or how to choose investments. And they might start employing that method, and they might overweight cases where the method succeeds and underweight cases where the method fails. Right? Astrological reasoning can also involve particularly egregious sorts of confirmation bias. So suppose that you're someone who's very sympathetic to astrology or believes that using horoscopes is a good method, a reliable method for forming beliefs about the world, and you read that your horoscope for yesterday said that you were going to have a difficult day, and then you reflect and you're like, oh, there were some difficult things that happened yesterday. Maybe I accidentally dropped my groceries and lost my milk or something. You can point to things that were difficult and that you take that as confirming the reliability of the horoscope. And the same thing probably would have happened if the horoscope had said it was not going to be a difficult day. You could point to other features of the day that were not difficult, and you would have taken that as evidence that the horoscope was reliable. So again, people here could be prone to confirmation bias. There's a ton of examples from politics we could come up with. Of course, the death penalty example being an easy one. All right, so what should our takeaways be here, right? We should realize that humans are often prone to weight evidence in favor of their prior views more strongly than they should, right? And this should motivate us to be careful when weighing up evidence that we know bears upon our prior viewpoints. This is particularly in the case when we're dealing with viewpoints or propositions that are particularly significant or emotional or central to us. Also, it may be helpful to sometimes ask ourselves, right, what would evidence against my current views look like? So instead of just going around looking for evidence that would confirm our views or we think might support our views, we should ask ourselves what evidence would possibly undermine our views. And then we can be on the lookout for that sort of evidence as well and get a more balanced take or approach that can help us avoid the areas of confirmation bias. All right, thanks so much for watching this video. Please remember to complete the participation poll and then tune into the next video.